Oh, hello there, ladies and gentlemen. How are you doing? By the time this episode airs, I think school will be close to being out, if not already out. Especially those in college like me, you're just waiting and waiting and dreading until the day comes and summer, boom, vacation. Today's episode of the podcast, we have a man who has worked for Paramount Pictures, Warner Bros, a local there in Corsicana, Texas. Writer, producer, director. His name is James Willis. Very fun. I had the pleasure of working with him last year on the documentary, which we're discussing, called Field of Valor, Air Activities of Texas, which covers the Corsicana Airport. For those who don't know, used to serve as a military base, a pilot school, training school for training pilots before World War II started, and even when it was going on. Had over 8,000 go through that school. Fun, interesting history that we get to run through. Nice. I'm really looking forward to this documentary. And once this airs, I'm sure I will come back and let you know when it does all over the internet. Thanks for listening. And here we go. A live part-time James Willis. Enjoy. Welcome back again to Live Part-Time. As you can see today, we have our new guest. I keep saying new guest. I don't mean to. James Willis. James, thanks for being on the show today.
Thank you, James.
Thank you for having me.
So start out, tell us a little bit about the background of your film career and where it all started.
Well, basically Corsicana, family moved there in 84, and neighborhood I moved into, my next door neighbor was David Huffman. His dad was Lloyd Huffman. Lloyd was very involved with the college and the television program and one of the boards that bought equipment for it and so forth. And we decided we were going to do a little sci-fi show back in 87. And we started to build all these. Well, actually, David built the sets. And we had some pretty good-sized pieces that we were going to try to shoot wherever we could. And his dad owned Huffman Communications, and he had a second building, which used to be his old shop, and had a big interior garage in there that they used to install radios and so forth. And he said, well, if you guys clean this thing up, he had a renter skip out on him. He had a sheet metal company, so the whole place was just littered with stuff. If you clean it up, you can use it till I sell it. Well, we used it for 2 years, and we had the whole thing full of sets. And we did like 4 episodes of this little thing and took it down to AggieCon at Texas A&M. And they showed it down there. And so we did that for that period of time. Also did that as a college course, a practicum in television production. So I ended up getting 3 college credits out of that for doing that. So after that was done, we kind of took a summer off and decided we were going to do a feature film and actually shoot it on film rather than video. In those days, gosh, it sounds like a long time ago, but it was just 1990. In those days, you couldn't get anything in distribution if it wasn't shot on film because video wasn't to the scale it is today.
Yeah. Now the world has changed.
If you shot it on video, they wouldn't touch it, so it had to be shot on film. So we shot it on 16 millimeter film, and it was a horror film called The Dreaded. We shot that over the summer of 1990, and shot in one of the old oil mansions there and around town, and
just with local actors and everything.
Yeah, pretty much. We had some people who had been in some other things, but mostly it was just local people. Lloyd again shot it. I produced it, and a friend of mine, Chris Robinson, directed it. Basically, the same group that did the sci-fi shows kind of transferred to this.
Yeah.
But it was a much bigger. Well, in some ways, it was bigger. We didn't have as many sets. It was all location shooting, but. Anyway, so that went in the distribution in 1993, that was kind of a learning experience because the distributor out of LA ended up kind of screwing us around.
Look at Hollywood, still messing people around.
Yep.
And that was just before the internet hit, so it was a lot easier for them to take advantage of producers. In fact, I had the president of sales call me after he left the company and told me about what the company did to other people, and I had people wanted to get in a class action lawsuit, but I would have had to spend as my share more than I spent on the movie just to sue them. So it was a good learning experience, but it wasn't really a profitable endeavor. It is out. It can still be found. It's been released in 8 or 9 countries. You can get the DVD out of Britain, and the VHSs still pop up now and then on Amazon. But and it did video store runs here in the United States. But it was a small film, but it was for a bunch of 20-year-olds. It was just what we spent on it and what we did with it.
It was like in the summer, like just a little fun little summer project.
We did it every weekend through that whole summer.
That's cool. Yeah.
So. Which is not the best way to do a film, but it worked, and we got it done, and we basically all split up after that year, and everyone went off to the 4-year schools. I went up to North Texas. I did get on with Paramount Pictures on Necessary Roughness, the football movie with Scott Bakula, and Sinbad, or Kathy Ireland.
Sinbad.
So that was, and then I got hired on to that. I started out as an intern, then got hired on. So worked on that for about 3 months. And that was a great experience. Got to talk to Mace Neufeld, who produced The Hunt for Red October and Patriot Games and all the Jack Ryan movies. And he was doing some of the biggest films in Hollywood at the time. So he was great. And then Howard Koch, whose father was president of Paramount Pictures in the 70s, was the executive producer. So I got to spend some time with them and talk to them. It was really, everyone else is running for the actors and I'm running for the producers.
That's the smart thing to do, though. That's the way to go.
So, and he actually watched The Dreaded and talked to me about it. Anyway, it was a good experience. Then went to work for a company called Video Plus up in between Denton and Louisville that did business television, direct sales stuff for companies like Avon and Mary Kay and that type of material. And did that, worked my way up from duplication, which was VHS when I started there, and worked up to production manager there over about 7 years. And in between, right after that, I worked art department for Warner Bros. Any Given Sunday, which was Oliver Stone's film. So that was
with Jamie Foxx.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good movie.
Yeah, at the old Texas Stadium.
Yeah.
That was, oh my gosh, that place was nasty. Working there for over a month in the summertime. But anyway, if the wind blew just right, it'd come in from the Trinity River and snow. But so worked on that. Wanted to get some experience. I'd never worked in art department before, so that was actually a great experience. And I did some commercials after that for some of the same guys. But then kind of stayed in the corporate market and did that. We actually went in the movie theaters and was a general manager, assistant manager, and then general manager later for about 11 years. And then I still did my projects on the side and so forth. And ended up back in Corsicana with a theater company and decided to form Ignite Productions to do corporate projects and, weddings and all kinds of different things, shooting sports. And we had been trying for a while to kind of develop a project. And we're looking at doing another low-budget horror film and just thought it was going to be too involved to get people to work on it and so forth because it was going to be very low budget. So I thought about this story about the old Corsicana airport. I had known for quite a while it was a flight training base for the Army in World War II. and always thought that would make an interesting documentary. In fact, when I was in the Rotary Club in Corsicana, I had them come out from the museum there at the airport, and Gary and Sarah Farley.
Lovely people.
Yes, they are, and they head up the memorial out there, and they're the fixed base operators at the airport, but then they run the museum as well. And they gave a kind of a lecture on it for the group, and I told them, well, if they ever needed, because they want to build a freestanding museum. They have it in like 3 different buildings right now, and they've got stuff they can't put in there, so they were looking to maybe do a video, and I was starting my company, so I said, well, if you ever decide to do it, let me know. And eventually, it kind of circled back around when I was when I decided this low-budget feature wasn't going to happen. And I said, well, what can I do that's manageable? And
So
that's
how old were you when you went how old were you when you found out about the Corsicana Airport, you said? You were in college?
Yeah, I first heard about the history out there when I was in college.
Okay.
In fact, Tommy Stringer, Dr. Tommy Stringer, who is the historian interviewed in the project, he was my history professor at Navarro when he was still teaching. And he told us about a lot of the history in the area. Mm-hmm. Anything like Fort Parker and Mejia to the air base. And then Lloyd Huffman, who became the director of photography on this, who had also worked on the Dreaded and the sci-fi projects. He did a little piece when we were taking television classes out there while I was still a senior in high school. And he did a little piece on it, like a 10-minute, 15-minute piece where he had some pictures and so forth. That's how I first became aware of it. So 25, 30 years later, I had met the people running the museum, and it kind of kept it in the back of my head since 2014, and then it came back around. And we thought, okay, well, this would be something we can do that's manageable and budget-wise, people-wise, and so forth. And then I decided if we were going to do that, I was going to want to have something a little more dramatic, because I wanted to do a feature.
All right.
And I thought, well, I'll do this documentary, but we'll do it sort of like a docudrama, and we'll do some reenactments, because they had 3 PT-19 airplanes, which were the trainers they used at the time. They had the original hangars. They had the museum. They had a lot of uniform material. So we figured, well, we'll add that to it. It's going to cost a little bit more, but that will make it more interesting for me and more interesting to the audience, rather than just seeing black and white photos and stock footage all the time. So it started out very, very small. And then when we got into the reenactment stuff, we wanted to shoot it in the spring of, I guess it would have been 2017. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we weren't going to make it in time. We had to do a rough script, which was very rough. It was just more of an outline. It's completely changed since then. It was like a 11-page outline. And so we went out and scheduled that and decided to do that in the fall, and we were going to start interviewing throughout the summer. Mm-hmm. And so we did most of the interviews beforehand. We did a couple just before and after. We interviewed we interviewed a former instructor there who's now 101. He instructed here for 2 years, or in Corsicana for 2 years. Out of the 3.5, it was an operation. And then we had 2 cadets that we interviewed. One's in California and one's in West Virginia that are still living.
Wow.
You managed to track them down?
Actually, they had at the Gary and Sarah both, they knew them because they had them when they built the memorial for the cadets. They had to have someone who could give them, what they looked like when they were walking and how they wore the parachutes.
Oh, yeah.
So they consulted on all that. And they had known them because they would come through. People would come through, I trained here. Or they'd bring their family, or their kids would come and say, okay, my dad trained here. And so they knew of them, and they gave me the contact information, and I went and contacted them, set up the interviews. I had a crew in L.A. do the guy out there. I had a crew in Virginia do the West Virginia shoot, and everything else we did locally. But we had people from, I guess it was like 7 or 8 states involved in it. We had a costume designer from Albuquerque.
Tabitha, yeah.
Yeah.
Very, very nice.
We had our music guys, which we just signed, is going to be out of Dallas. We had people from Louisiana who did some of the roles in it. So we had, the co-producer, co-writer was out of Phoenix. So, who used to live here in Dallas, and that's how I got to know him. So we've worked on several projects together, but that's kind of how it kind of came together. And then it just kind of grew from there as the more we found out that we could get and more that we found out about, I knew it was a training facility, but I didn't know the details. It's much more involved and had much more. It actually was open before we were in the war because in 1939, they knew we were going to be in the war. The politicians didn't want to talk about it. The president knew, and the army definitely knew we were going to be in that war. It was just a matter of time. So in 1939, they started a crash course getting the military in place because we were probably behind the Hungarian army in size at that time.
Wow, that's small.
So it was kind of a desperate crash measure. They realized they were going to need like 200,000 pilots, and they were currently training about 500 to 750 pilots a year in the United States for the Army.
A year in the United States alone?
Yes.
Wow.
Well, they were training 500 to 750 combat pilots, and the whole Army Air Corps was about 25,000 people at that time. And they figured by the time they were done, they were going to need 200,000 pilots.
So how many, maybe or have a guess, how many airports do you think there were around the country that they were doing
this type of base?
Yeah.
From what I understand, there were 60.
60?
Spread throughout the country.
Oh, okay.
Most of them were in Texas and Oklahoma because of the favorable flying conditions. There were some in California. There were some in Georgia. There were some on the East Coast. But the majority of them were in the Southwest just because of the conditions.
Oh, that's still not that many.
Yeah, no.
And for instance, Corsicana, 8,000 cadets went through Corsicana and 5,000 graduated. Now, the additional ones, if they were what they called washed out, put in the washing machine, ready to be thrown out because they either were not doing what they're supposed to or they just couldn't handle flying, they just wasn't in there, they would move them into being a bombardier or a navigator. One of these guys that I interviewed, he graduated the program, but he got tossed out in the basic section when he moved on from Corsicana because he liked to hedge hop with his plane and he got caught.
What is that exactly?
With flying too low.
What?
Buzzing people on the ground or buzzing things on the ground.
Oh, wow.
And someone got his number and turned him in, and he was very good in the interview about it, talked about it, and said the base commander brought him in and said, I hear you like to fly low, so we got a program for you. It's the glider program. Gliders like to fly low. So he was transferred in that program. Then he ended up coming back. They had him take another exam to go back in the cadet program when they changed the glider program during the war, and then said, no, you're too smart. We're going to make you a navigator and put you on a bomber. So he ended up on B-26s. So yeah, it was very interesting talking to these people, where they went and the things they did. And he was very open about it. He just finished a book on the B-26s that I think just came out. But it's very interesting meeting the different people that were involved in this. And it really was fairly complex. And we're trying to, in putting the script together, I found a lot of times we were going out and explaining too much. So,
like how so?
Well, there were, like when you talk about the bureaucracy and the politics of the Army.
Oh, okay.
The Army, obviously at that time there was no Air Force. What they called the Air Force was the Army Air Corps, which later became the Army Air Forces. So, but the development of that program during the war changed so dramatically over time that they wanted to make it its own arm of the Army, but yet part of the Army wanted to control it. And then you have these congressional acts that created these portions of it. And this had gone all the way back through World War I, how the Army Air Forces became what it was. And then, of course, after the war, it became the Air Force on its own. And but it's very, when you talk about the history of it, you have to be very careful what you say, because it's not, it may be partially true, but it isn't totally true. So, I mean, if you say the Air Corps, well, that's to a certain year. If you say the Army Air Forces, that's a year. Even the symbols changed all along.
Yeah.
So on the planes, which most people, they're not going to care about unless you're a, a history buff or really into it, which there are a lot of people. So we have Gary and Sarah Farley, our consultants. We'd take the script, and even when we were picking who was going to be in it, I'd take pictures that they sent me and their weight and their height and so forth, because you had to be a certain size to fit in the plane. Just like today, you can't be a fighter pilot if you're too tall or if you're too short. So
what's too tall? Do you know?
I think what they said, anything over like 5'10" would be too tall. If you were
I was
right
on
up
my
to
way,
6
but
feet.
never mind. Dream killer.
And they so I would send the pictures, and they'd look at them and say, okay, this one's too young, this one's too old, because most of these guys were between 19 and 23, the cadets, and the instructors were probably 26, 27 years old.
Dang.
So actually, this one gentleman that we interviewed, when he was from New Jersey, Lakehurst, New Jersey area, and he was 19 when he joined up. Ended up here in Corsicana, but a lot of them were older. Most of his roommates were from. He had one West Point roommate, because they did have West Point cadets here too. They would send him here for the first phase of flight training, and then they would send them back to West Point for the basic training. But so they were very young, and even the instructors, the old guys were in their mid to late 20s.
Yeah, still young.
So, and a lot of that has to do with being able to take the agility and so forth of, the flight, because they trained in open cockpit planes. The open cockpit planes were cheaper to manufacture,
Yeah.
and they were easier to fly. But a lot of it came down to economics. All the planes that they would be flying later, whether they were bombers or fighters, were closed cockpit. But that's a leftover sort of thing from the World War I generation. But they were small planes, but if you're up close to them, they're really not that little.
Yeah.
But they weren't a horribly powerful plane. They were just enough to make sure that they could fly, do some aerobatics, and move on to the next stage.
So, talk a little bit about the school. What were kind of like the entry points and the basics? And obviously, they didn't throw you right into the plane and say good luck. I mean, what was that all like?
From what I found out, and you get different. You have some of the guys that trained there. They'll tell you some things. You get memory working. This is 73 years ago. So, and then you've got the consultants talking. So basically, what you had the primary flight schools, and then they went on, and this was a primary flight school. This was where they would first time, a lot of these guys, in fact, one of these guys said he had never driven a car before he flew a plane.
What?
So, it wasn't that common. Like today,
crazy.
Everybody has a car when they're 16, It wasn't that way then. So, he said he flew a plane before he ever flew or drove a car.
That'd be pretty cool to say.
Well, what's his experience when he first drives a car? Like, what do I do?
So
just,
boring.
Probably bored.
Yeah, what do I do? Just sit here and steer? Like, I'm supposed to look at trees all day? It's boring.
So what they would do is they'd send them to Randolph Field in San Antonio, which is the main. At that time, it pretty much still is for the most part. It's the main facility for flight training in the United States. And then there was another base not far from there that they also did some of the same things. They would send them all there, and they would learn military etiquette. They'd have their what we would call basic training.
Right.
When I talk about basic and flight training, it's different, but
Yeah.
they would learn their
Hell
military
Week?
etiquette.
Is that what they call it? Hell Week or something like that?
So they'd learn how to salute and how to act like they were in the military and how to dress and all that rigmarole. Then they would send them. They would either keep some there, or they'd send them all across the country to these bases, and they'd just spread them out. Like I said, Randolph Field was set up to train 500, 750 pilots a year. So, and you look at Corsicana, in 3.5 years ran 8,000 people
Wow.
through the doors.
And they all like were housed on the base.
Yes, they had. They weren't like barracks; they were more like dormitories. They had 3 or 4 to a room, but they were a lot nicer than a military facility because these were civilian flying schools. That was part of the Hap Arnold, who was the general in charge of the Air Corps at the time, was thrown this. We have to get ready. We're going to be in the war, but Congress isn't going to give us any money because we're not in the war, and everybody says we're not going to be in the war because we're neutral. So, but yet we had to be ready because they knew we were going to be in it one way or the other. So
Inevitable.
they had to figure out a way. The military could not train all these people. Like I said, the whole Army Air Corps was like 25,000 people. So the logistics of it was massive. So they sat down, or Arnold sat down with the 8 major flying schools throughout the country. There were different cities from, I know there were some in Tulsa, Oklahoma City, Dallas, that had flight schools that were civilian flight schools, taught people how to fly. And most of these guys were former World War I pilots that started these schools. So they had batted this back and forth for a while, but he brought them to Washington in about 5 minutes, said, can you do this, and can you do it if we don't pay you? We might be able to pay you, but we can't pay you right now. Will you build the facilities? Will you add on to the facilities? Will you take out loans? We're going to war. We have to have the people. The military cannot train this number of people. We don't have the ability. We don't have this infrastructure to do it. So they said, yes, we would be willing to jump out on the limb. And they started out with those 8 civilian flying schools became Army primary schools. The civilians would provide the buildings, the teachers, the instructors. The Army would provide the planes, the outside maintenance. If they had a major maintenance issue, they would provide contract work on it, even though they had mechanics there they were working on. They had a couple hundred planes at each of these places, so you had to have people there. Now, if they had a major problem, they would ship the plane off to like Houston to a contractor.
So you're saying back in the day, things were built and money was spent other than the government?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And they actually did it not knowing
That's
if they were ever going to
crazy.
get repaid.
Now we got to have the government pay for roads.
So they basically set up the business end, and then the Army provided. They had several military. They had like the head of the base was an Army officer. They had check pilots that were Army. They had other people there that were Army, but then they also had the civilian instructors, which were sort of inducted into the Army. It's kind of I'm not going to say haphazard because it worked so well, but it was really kind of a risky thing for the Army to do, and it was very risky for the civilians to do. Because, the public knowledge was we're not going to get in this war. We're going to stay out of it because of the experience of World War I. But that just wasn't going to be possible. And one of the guys that we interviewed, two of them actually, they're the nephews of one of the training pilots that died during the war. And we interviewed them about their uncle. And he was... I believe he was here before Pearl Harbor. They opened in 41, but they opened in early 41. And of course, Pearl Harbor came at the end of the year. So they were well into the program. And in fact, Corsicana was considered in the second wave of schools. because the first ones were the first. They wanted to test it first. They took the 8 primary schools they talked about. Once they got it established how it would work, then they duplicated it.
Yeah.
And started opening up schools, and purely for this purpose, by itself. So Corsicana was one of those. They had local investors. One of them was from Waxahachie. There were a few from Corsicana.
So there were no like World War I veterans that owned the Corsicana airport, like you were saying.
Not
they asked them-
Corsicana. That was owned by a group of businessmen who did have some. One of them had some aircraft background.
Yeah.
But to them, it was a business, but it was also a very patriotic
That's
thing
what I was about to
because it's hard to. Today we don't look at it quite the way they did then, but then we haven't been in a situation they were.
Yeah.
Well, the World War I veterans committing to it makes kind of sense.
Yeah,
they've been through it, and
they knew. Yeah,
and leading into World War One, America was in a Great Depression. It was terrible, so they could kind of have a feeling of, yeah, I can understand that we got to put our foot forward and help this country get somewhere.
So to get it started, the guys that invested in it had to buy a school in Houston that was called Air Activities of Houston, because it was the CAA, not the FAA back then. But these schools, if they were going to be Army primary schools, had to have a certification from the Aircraft Administration. So that was not easy to get. But if you bought a school that already had a certification and moved it and renamed it, then that made it all legal.
Nice.
So that's how they started Air Activities of Texas, which was the base in Corsicana. And like I said, it was built early on in the second wave of construction. And a lot of the guys that started there before we actually entered the war were some of the first in combat when we got in the war.
Oh, okay.
So they got a jump start on a lot of these other bases. So you probably say there's probably more percentage of casualties and deaths of the people that came out of there because it was an operation longer. So it's very interesting. I mean, you think about these guys, like this 19-year-old who said he came down here, learned to fly. He had never been very far away. He was from New Jersey. He hadn't been very far away from home, hadn't driven a car. And all of a sudden, he's halfway, across the country in this small
Jersey
Texas
to
town, And so, I mean, it's interesting hearing their stories. And you think of that today. I mean, most, 18, 19-year-olds that do not go into the Army, most of them would, to think that they could even just jump off and just go.
Oh, no way.
It's
Not
just
a
not
chance.
that way anymore. So, and part of it, I guess, is because they had to. So,
Yeah.
there really wasn't much choice in the matter. So, and a lot of them, if they were going to get drafted, they were going to get put where the Army wanted to put them. You could end up in the infantry and so forth. If you went ahead and joined, then if you could pass the tests and so forth, you could get into the Air Corps. And, obviously being a pilot was considered a much better duty than being in the infantry. So, but so a lot of them that wanted to fly, they went ahead and joined up and got to pick where they went for the most part.
What was it like? Because when I think of Corsicana, Texas, I picture all these empty buildings and stuff. I don't know.
Well, it was the first town in Texas they struck oil in, and that's where Mobil and Texaco started. Oh. Texaco was the Texas company.
I don't know
Actually, there was a little boom town called Tuckertown, not far from where the airport is located, probably a mile. And there were 6,000 people within 6 months in that little town. It was a giant oil field. But that was Corsicana's claim to fame. The Mobil pipeline is still there. That was the first oil refinery in Texas. And they had trolleys back and forth from like San Antonio to Dallas every day through Corsicana. And so there was a lot of new millionaires in the area. Now there's still oil there today, but it obviously is not. I mean, it's not what it was then. It's not the metropolis that it was becoming and went through the 20s and 30s and 40s.
Yeah. But when I think about it, I mean, if 8,000 people, were most of them from Texas, or they were just
They were from everywhere.
They were so
In fact, they didn't usually send. They kind of had a policy that they didn't want local people to be trained locally.
Yeah.
So you had people coming from, all over the country here, and then you might have a guy join up here and end up training in Georgia.
Yeah.
Well, why was that though?
I think that was
Maybe like bias,
Because that
I
is-
don't
well,
know. Like, because when I think you can't. Well, I know. I think it might have changed.
I
but
think if you had someone that was basically at home, they weren't going to be as self-sufficient.
Yeah.
I guess that's just my guess.
like your
from
teacher
what I
being your
understood.
mom or dad, like
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
school. Like,
So it's like that was kind of a
Being
way
comfortable kind of thing.
yeah,
Because you're not going to be comfortable when you're shipped off. So
get
you used
I
to
think
that
that was a way
already.
of keeping you on your toes and
Yeah,
and
exactly.
keeping you concentrated on what you were doing. I mean, that's what I kind of got from it.
and it's a blank slate. So once you get a blank slate with someone and they come into your
yeah.
Well, you're indoctrinating them into the way the Army
Yeah.
works, and they want you to do it the Army way. And
right next to
if
home,
you
you're not-
were going out with your friends every weekend,
Yeah, you're not
when
going
you were
anywhere.
off, you weren't gonna. So, and I think it was part of that growing up experience too. Is that like these guys were traveling by train across the country, and they had never been away from home before, and so I think that's what was behind a lot of that.
That's a lost era, right there.
But did Corsicana change much? Did the economy change much? I mean, you probably don't. I'm just kind of asking, but because
With
you
the
have
base coming into town?
8,000 new people like that, like
Well, it was 8,000 over 3.5 years.
Right,
So
right.
they usually had an underclass and an upper class. They were training there at the same time, and there were about a staff to run the place of about 500 people, and then there were approximately, depending on when in the war it was, between 350 to 400 cadets. So you're talking about about 900 to 1,000 people there at a time between staff and cadets. The first batch of cadets, there were 50. The first group that came through. By 42, 43, they were getting 300 cadets at a time, because as the war went on, the numbers went up. And then as the war started to dwindle down, the numbers went down.
right. What's the time frame of school for pilot?
It was, that they stayed there?
yeah, like, is it like
It was a 10-week program. They had to learn to fly in 10 weeks. Most of them
Wow,
learned,
that's quick.
that's
they-
so quick.
a lot of them soloed after 8-10 hours of training.
Wow.
And if they were over 12, they were in danger of being removed from the program. So they had to sit down and do a check with one of the flight instructors, one of the Army flight instructors, to see if they were actually going to be able to make it, because they were investing a lot of money in these guys. And if it wasn't going to work, they were going to get them out of there as fast as they could into another program and get someone else in their place.
Well,
So-
didn't they get shipped back to like just infantry if they didn't pass?
The Army Air Corps would generally keep them within the Air Corps.
Okay.
So they would either make them a navigator, a bombardier,
Okay.
a gunner
Right.
on a bomber.
Or maybe like a mechanic or something.
Some of them may have gone on to be
Yeah,
mechanics.
okay.
But they would. It's not like they would throw you to a different part of it. Once you were in the Air Corps, they wanted to keep you in the Air
Yeah,
Corps.
I got you.
So because they had invested the time and money in you, so you weren't going to be a pilot, but you could be a navigator. If you couldn't be a navigator, you could be a gunner. So there was always something they could do, because they didn't want to turn you back into the what would you call it?
The general populace.
The general populace of the Army, I guess. So it was interesting how it was structured. And like I said, it was a lot of people looked at it. And when I first read about it, it's like, well, how could they train military pilots for combat at civilian schools run by civilians with some Army staff and make it work? And it did work.
In 10 weeks.
In fact, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, now
that's
the total program is like 50 hours. The first part of it, which was the primary, were 10 weeks. Then you went on to basic, another 10 weeks, and then you went on to the next stage, and that may have been, most of them were 10 weeks, some of them were longer, depending on what it was. Basically, primary, you learn to fly, you learn how to do acrobatics, some acrobatics. They wouldn't let you fly in formation, but they would let you spin around and do that kind of thing. You know, it's amazing what they taught them. And, you know, when I first started looking into this, I was under the understanding they weren't allowed to do acrobatics or anything like that, and that was not true. They had them a portion of the time they were there. They were learning that because you had to learn it, because if you were going to be a combat pilot,
Right.
and they didn't train you from the very beginning. I mean, once they got you into the air, it was a pretty fast-paced program. So you can imagine a lot of people that there were people that were just meant for that kind of thing. My grandfather was in the Air Corps, and he went to Randolph Field, I believe, originally. And he didn't end up becoming a pilot. And what he always told us is he just didn't have he wasn't a natural born pilot. You know, some people, it's just like some people can't drive cars very well.
You have to have that edginess.
Yeah, you have to have
be a pilot like that.
You know, that mindset, I guess. Well, he became a drill sergeant in the Air Corps, and he trained, you know, people coming through the Air Corps, and that's what he did. But so everyone goes in there, and then they filter you to where they think you're best going to be suited. But it was very fast paced, and I can't imagine someone learning with 10 hours of flight time.
I couldn't
or
either.
less, or 8 hours. You know, so some of these guys were soloing by themselves at 8 hours. And
especially these days too. Like, that's not even heard of.
And they didn't have any radios in those planes. They didn't have any electronics.
Yeah. So what did they do what did they have to like kind of talk to each other?
On the ground, if they were flying, they had flags, so they would wave them off with flags, or they would give them directions by flags. In the plane themselves, they had a Gossport, which is basically a tube that ran between the instructor and the cadet. And the instructor could talk to the cadet, but the cadet could not talk to the instructor.
So there's only a tube from the instructor to the cadet.
Yeah, and it was basically if you think of the old blowhorn type things on a ship, where you talk through the horn. You know.
I'll put a picture of that right now, and you'll see what the helmets look like, because the helmets were interesting. Because I think it was Gary that told us it looks like little horns on the side.
Yeah, it was like little tubes,
and they're just little metal tubes.
Yeah, metal tubes. But I think it was Gary that said that whenever the instructor knew he wasn't listening, he would hold the tube out into the air, so it's blowing into his ear, just eardrums blowing full.
He said they had some mean instructors that did that. Or they would grab because they were both on the same stick. So if you grabbed the stick and went like that, then it was going to hit them in the legs too, in the back, and they'd get their attention. So
you got to learn.
You didn't, these guys didn't have a chance. If you told them to do something, they didn't understand you. Well, they couldn't say, "What do you mean? Explain that again."
Yeah,
just do it. And if you
they weren't
do
FaceTiming.
They weren't Skyping.
They weren't Skyping back.
Texting.
How'd they do that?
LOL is so fun.
Back on that message. Oh, he's typing back. Hold on. I'll know soon.
In the planes they would be in combat, they obviously had radios, but these were being built. I mean, these planes were basically fabric and wood.
Just for training purposes.
I mean, when you're up close to them, it doesn't. You'd think it's metal, but it's not.
I mean, it probably helped training in those, and then going.
Yeah, just
even though they got better, it's like, well, I know how to do it just from our knockoffs. Yeah, you do what you work with what you got.
And they didn't even have electronic starters for the propellers. They had to be either hand propped or they had a machine.
Anybody die from that?
Yeah. What's that?
Anybody die from that?
I'm sure there probably was. No one in Corsicana. I mean, they had accidents, but Corsicana's record was pretty good.
Really?
That's crazy.
They did have the second top ace in the World War II trained at Corsicana, Major Tommy McGuire. He ended up, he was killed in combat. I think it may have been 45 in the Pacific, but he was the second top ace of the country.
What is that? No, explain what that is exactly.
The ace is if you, how many people you shot down. He had, I don't remember the exact number of kills, but he had between 23 or 28 planes he took down that he was credited with. He had more than that.
Wow.
But you had to, in order to get the credit for it, and that's where you saw on the planes, they would put for the Japanese, they'd put the little Japanese symbols, how many planes they shot down. You had to have someone witness you shooting someone down to get credit for it and to be on the book. So he had things that were obviously, and he was in competition with another guy
competition.
Yeah, and it was kind of a competition in a way. The
You got
Pacific
to do
was
something.
different.
You got to do something to like ease and kind of.
Yeah.
I guess find enjoyment in what you're doing.
Well, if they got to that position, then they would send them back on war bond tours and so forth. Now McGuire didn't get that lucky. He kind of got in a position. He was, I believe, 23, and he was at the rank of major.
Wow.
He had his own squadron.
Dang.
Well, he was on one of the memorials. Like he was one of the featured.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Because of his position. McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey is named after Tommy McGuire.
Okay.
There's several books out about him. I read that, and it's very interesting because in the Pacific, they worked it a little bit different. He had, I don't know if it was 225 hours of combat time or 225 some missions, but basically in Europe, which is where we put our emphasis at first, even though we had been attacked by Japan, it was decided that we'd take out the Nazis first. That would be our primary, and we would basically fight the Japanese, but it was more of a holding action. So the guys that flew in Europe, like bombers, they got to the point where you flew 25 missions, you would rotate out. If you could survive 25 missions and live through it, then you would not have to do anymore.
Wow.
They didn't do that in the Pacific. With the fighter pilots, they just flew and flew and flew. And if you started to get enough kills, they didn't want you killed. So McGuire was in the spot that he didn't want to go home, but then he did want to go home. He had just gotten married, and the general that was over their area was trying to keep him out of dangerous situations, along with the guy that was ahead of him, because they wanted to be able to, they didn't want their top guys killed off. In fact, McGuire wrote the Pacific, some of their fighting manuals.
Oh wow!
At 23 years old, so
That's crazy.
I can't write. I can't write.
He was a major at 23.
Here's how to cook chicken in the oven.
It's unheard of, but I mean, this stuff moves so fast.
Yeah.
But this other gentleman who interviewed his nephews, that I don't believe either of them ever got to meet him, because he died when he was 22 or 23, I believe, and he had come back from North Africa and was killed in a training accident in Florida. But he originally, when they sent him over there, when they first sent them to their location, they put them on it was an aircraft carrier, but it was what they call a pocket aircraft carrier. I may not have my terms right, but basically it was an old oil tanker converted into an aircraft carrier. The smaller ones, escort carriers. That's what they call them. Not a pocket battleship type thing, but escort carrier. And when they sent them off, they put them on the deck, and they said, "You're going to take off from the deck, and you're going to fly to your field," which we haven't captured yet. We're fighting for it right now. But when you get there, it should be ours. So the first time they flew off, and of course they had never flown off a ship before. This wasn't, it was a Navy ship, but these were Army pilots.
Yeah.
So, but that's the way they got them where they were going, and they take off, and you can't come back. You can't land on this thing. You only take off from it. So, and when they got to where they were going, they had to get in the fight because they hadn't cleared that field yet. It was a Japanese field, I guess, at the time. And so they were in a fight before they ever could get to the ground to where they were going. So
you said the creator of Star Trek also went through this school, right?
Gene Roddenberry was he did his primary flight training here. I believe it was 42, and
In Corsicana?
yes,
Of course.
and then he went on to be a B-17 bomber pilot. After he got out of the service, he went to fly for Pan Am
Oh, cool.
and flew for them for several years. Then he joined the Los Angeles Police Department and became a motorcycle cop. And he started his television writing, under a different name. He did Have Gun, Will Travel, Dragnet, and he met all these guys, and he wrote for them under a different name until he got enough work going, and then he resigned, and then he started to write full time and got into producing.
So I don't know him, but I think he created Star Trek when he was flying to Japan. They're like, "Hey, you're gonna go land here." we don't own the area yet. And he's just saying prayers like, where would I rather be right now? What if there was this going on in space? I'd rather be there than being in this crappy plane.
One of his biographies, and there's several on him, but one of them talks about his time in Corsicana, and he supposedly developed the characters based on guys he trained with here in Corsicana. So the Kirk and Spock and the McCoy characters were based on guys he trained with.
Oh, wow.
And this came back years later, the personalities.
Yeah.
So
is he still alive? What?
No.
he died in 1996, I believe.
96. Oh, wow.
How old was he?
He was in his 70s, and he
okay.
was not well. But he was originally from El Paso, so he is from Texas.
Oh, wow. Cool. I didn't know that. Yeah, that's interesting.
And yeah, he obviously got into television, writing a bunch of westerns, and then he created Star Trek and produced that for the 3 years it was on. And then,
How do you go from westerns to Star Trek?
well, he sold Star
Western
Trek.
space.
He sold Star Trek as Wagon Train to the Stars because westerns were the primary entertainment
Yeah.
for television at the time.
Okay.
So if you think about it, everybody had westerns and westerns and westerns, and now you don't have
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
maybe
That's a
one
good
or
point.
two. Yeah. So when he took it to the networks, he had to, this is going to be the Wagon Train to the Stars, and
interesting.
So, and of course it really wasn't, but
So what was his name again?
Gene Roddenberry.
Gene Roddenberry. Okay.
So, talk about, and you talked a little bit about the interviews. How was it? Talk a little about the filming process and what it was like with having all these young dudes out here dressed up. And you have Gary, you have your producer on set, you got Lloyd, you had awesome costume designer and people doing photos. Like, what was that experience like? How did you enjoy that?
Well, when we first started doing the casting, like I said, we had to go through. I would send pictures over, and then I'd wait for responses. And some of them were kind of funny because I said, I'd send this guy over, and it's like, I think he looks a little young, but you look at him and they come back. Oh yeah, this one's too young. This one's too short. This one's too tall. I mean, they're very nice about it, but they said you can pick whoever you want. I said, but I need. We have to be realistic because we're going to set them in the plane if they're too tall to get in there. So they have to be, and there's a lot of people who will watch this kind of stuff that are a lot more
Critical.
into the critical
Yeah.
and into the planes and the, than what the average viewer would be. And I don't want, as I told Gary, I said, I want to keep it realistic. I don't want them coming after you as a consultant or me. And I'm sure we'll make mistakes or have made mistakes, but you want to get it as right as you can. So we did that, and we even brought the guys in, and Gary went through having them put on the parachutes so they'd know, what they'd have to carry and how heavy it was. And they had to run in these things, and then they had to sit, they basically sat on them in the plane and showed them how to get in the plane without falling through the bottom, because like I said, you're talking about fabric and wood except for the engine area and part of the cockpit. So if you stepped in the wrong spot, your foot might go through it. Yeah. So, these planes are antiques. They're flying antiques. So basically, the plane we used, I believe, was 73 years old. So he wanted to have them a little bit familiar so they kind of knew what they were looking at when they got into it, when they actually did the scene, where the instructor would sit, where the cadet would sit, what they were looking at, what was in there, what very little there was as far as, equipment and so forth. But, that was really real flying. It wasn't turn on the computer and the computer's going to help you. There was, and we have one of these guys, Stan Walsh, mentions, they said, yeah, they worked with computers. They had these little slide card deals where it had numbers on it, and they called it the computer to make calculations. And, and he says in the interview, we used the computer, and then he stopped himself and he said, well, but it's not the computer you're thinking about. It's, it's like more like a Chinese computer. You move the balls around and count them. But so it was real flying, and a lot of it you just had to know what to look for. But so we had that people who were somewhat knowledgeable and looked the part. I mean, they couldn't have blue hair and long hair. They had to have the haircut style pretty much close. And I know Casey I think you changed your.
Oh, I went and got a haircut and everything.
Yes.
I went to a barber. I said, I showed him like old school military style. So I need it just like this.
I mean, when we looked at his picture and everything, and he started out, he was going to work on the production. And then we had a guy that had an accident who was going to be in that part. And this was well before we shot. I mean, a couple months. So, after I met him, I thought, well, he could be an extra or he could do this. And I thought, well, he was the right size. He's the right age. And he looked like the type of person. See, they showed me all these pictures. This is what these guys looked like. They weren't really young, but they looked.
They weren't really big either.
Yeah, they were, baby.
Yeah. They didn't look like they were just walked out of high school, but they didn't look like they were in their 30s either. So it was kind of a mix. And then you had to get, I even had to go in on, and talk about black, white, Hispanic,
Yeah.
African American versus Hispanic. Well, this is World War II you're talking about. So they did have some African American cadets, but they were in special squadrons. They were segregated. Mm-hmm. So they would not be training with the same population. So when you're having people apply from all these different races because they're not thinking, man, I didn't put up there, can't use this, can't use that.
Right.
I didn't want to open that conversation.
Yeah.
But I had to keep it in mind. And it's like, you have a lot of this revisionist history in Hollywood today where you have, things that's, I don't think so, because they don't want to admit to our past. Well, our history is our history.
Yeah, it did happen.
So, and the troops were segregated until Korea. So now they did have African Americans working there.
Right.
I think they had, I'm not sure they had mechanics, but they had a lot of guys working in the facilities. Mm-hmm. So, and I mean, working regular jobs, not sweeping and mopping. I'm not trying to say it's, but they weren't in the cadet program.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, anyway, we got them cast, we had them come out, and Gary took them kind of on a tour of the planes and the parachutes, and then they kind of went over sizing up for the uniforms and so forth. And they had a lot of stuff for the museum that they had collected over time, and they went out and got additional Air Corps patches, and they already had the insignia, the rank insignia and so forth, and they had several models of the uniforms there. They have a lot of them now because I ended up giving them to them. So what we got, I went ahead and donated to the museum because they're going to use all these on mannequins and so forth. So Casey can come back 20 years from now and bring his kids and say, I wore that. So they'll be able to use that. As far as the shooting itself, we did some burning of some diesel and so forth out beyond the runway to make black smoke to look like there'd been a crash.
That was me. I died.
Yeah. His kid.
I was one of the firefighters.
Yeah, you were.
So we had the old fire truck and the old Jeep. These are 70-year-old deals, and is the fire truck going to make it this run?
I remember that.
Well, we did break down a few times.
Yeah, we lost the Jeep in one scene because it wouldn't start, and the next day it did. So they had a tire go flat on the fire truck the week of the shoot. Well, you can't just buy these tires. They do make them, but they make them only for movies, for old vehicles. Because if you look at this truck, I mean, it's not anything like today, the wheel sizes and all.
Right.
So they're only made for production vehicles, basically, for props. Well, Gary replaced that tire before I ever knew about it. He spent $500 getting that tire here. I mean, the tire was like $160 or $200, and they had to ship it from California.
Wow.
And get it on the truck and get the truck running and so forth. So they made a lot of contribution to getting the thing done to make sure it was going to happen. His brother came down. They worked on the Jeep and got it in the shape. They already had the stuff, but they added stuff to it. Mm-hmm. Made sure, he's very detailed about how things were supposed to look, how things were supposed to be.
Which I loved their involvement in.
Yeah,
all
yeah. And it's
I
like
talking
the
to them
uniforms and everything. They wouldn't wear it like that. I mean, they couldn't, their patches were certain places depending on what class they were in, and
Yeah. Right.
they couldn't wear goggles on their face unless they had soloed, and they couldn't do this, and they had to wear it like that, and it's like being a policeman in a movie or something.
Right.
You have to carry your arms a certain way. You can't
But
touch
that
the gun.
just makes it so realistic.
Yeah.
And that's the best part about it.
And that's so that was kind of that preliminary going over with everybody. And as far as the shooting, then we had two pilots. The guy that flew the plane, I believe, he might kill me if I get this wrong, but I think he was 80 or in his 80s. Bobby Gratham, I believe that's how he says it. He's with the Coyote Squadron of the Commemorative Air Force, which is based there at Corsicana Airport, and they have one PT-19, and then Gary and Sarah, the Heritage Museum, the Corsicana Field Aviation Heritage Foundation owns one of the planes, and then he himself owns the other PT-17. So we had 3 planes we used for that, and there were some other World War II planes that we had there that were available. So, basically, they made a lot of contribution in, if I was going to shoot it and cover the production, and they were going to make sure that the planes were, they had to all be insured because they didn't keep them insured all year long because they're antiques.
Right.
They're incredibly expensive to insure. So you might keep them insured for 6 months at a time. And then they have to go all kinds of things. Who's going to fly it? Can they fly it? Have they flown it before? What are their qualifications? All kinds of stuff that you would never even think of.
Yeah.
You'd have to deal with. And then, then we took, there's 2 fields at the airport. One is a paved field and one's a turf field. Well, they used all turf fields when it was in operation there. So the city shut down the turf field for that day we were shooting out there. And, so that we could use that to come in and land back and forth and do the aerial shots and so forth. And so that was very interesting, because you're dealing with some very old equipment. Now, the plane had no problems with the plane. Of course, that's kept up. You can't have, a truck, if it stalls well, you can, but you can't have the plane.
Right, yeah. That's
But the
totally
plane had not
different
been flown in 4 years. So that particular one, so...
Which I think it was David who got to fly in that too, by the way.
Yeah, it was David.
'Cause I think we did paper, scissors, rock or something.
Well, we still have a free pass to go out there
Yeah, that's what he said.
Yeah.
and fly if we want
Yeah.
to. So,
Check it out.
which I want to for sure.
But
Yeah, because that's if you go to the air show, you can do it with the Commemorative Air Force. It's like $300 to get a ride in one of those things because it's so expensive to fly them.
Yeah,
Between the insurance, the gas, and just the upkeep on the things. If a part breaks, you can't just go down to Walmart and buy
right.
it.
Yeah,
So,
you gotta do some,
you have to
do some
basically
deep
have to
research on
find
it.
another plane and
Yeah.
steal it off of it. We had a rear tire go out when we were shooting on one of the planes, and it wasn't a huge deal, but it's one of those small. You can't just go buy it from aircraft supplies.
Yeah.
So it's getting there. I'm hoping June or July.
June or July. Yeah.
that will be the
The premiere will do that, and then we'll start running it through film festivals.
And where will that premiere be? Do you know?
It's going to be, I'm hoping Corsicana. We had a date set for the Palace Theater, which is a restored theater there in Corsicana. It's very nice. We had it set for the week of Memorial Day week, and I don't think that's going to happen just because of the time it's taking to go through.
Right.
I want to get it right. I don't want to rush it.
Yeah,
So
I don't
want to
blame
sit
you on
on
that.
it forever. I want to get it done, but I don't want to be to where I'm down the week before pulling my hair out.
Yeah.
And I've done that before, and I don't. And usually that's always a bad situation. So,
Yeah.
so probably going to finish it up and then schedule it. Hopefully to be at the same place. If not, it'll be in Corsicana. It could be in Waxahachie. It could be in Dallas. It just depends on how it works out at that point. But,
Yeah.
And then, like I said, the film festivals, and then we'll see whether it goes any further than that. It's going to really depend on what it ends up looking like
Right.
and how it plays out.
So before we wrap it up, tell everybody where they can find everything. You said Field of Valor.
Fieldofvalor.com.
Okay, and it's called Field of Valor. Sorry, I'm so having a hard time saying that. Field of Valor, the Air Activities of Texas.
Field of Valor Air Activities of Texas.
Wow, sorry.
And I know that Explorer's got a thing coming out on it, and I'm sure there'll be some more publicity before it comes out. But I'm hoping.
Yeah, for sure.
And we'll try to build it up. I've thought about maybe doing some stuff at the air show as a promotion, which is in a couple weeks. So I did the first shoot for this thing last year's air show.
Dang.
So that was the first little pieces of. We were already working on a script, but I wanted to get some B-roll of stuff.
Yeah.
So
Well, I mean, I enjoy being part of the process, and I'm sure I know Gary and everybody out there appreciate you doing all this work and pushing for it.
they're paying for it.
Yeah. Well, but
No, I mean they're paying for it in the sense that Gary has to sit down and go through the script every
Yeah.
time I make a change.
Yeah.
Right.
And I ask him all these questions. Is this right? Is this right? Is this right? And and then he'll say something and I'll come back with something from another source saying something different. He says, ignore that. That's not right.
Well, it was an honor to be on that set too. I mean,
No,
to-
I appreciate you
to
guys
portray
doing that. It was
yeah,
those
and all
people.
the guys that were part of it. I mean, they're definitely gonna be pushing, and as soon as you get a release date, we're gonna be all shouting about it from the rooftops. So
I bet you could ask out of 10 people on the street in Corsicana if they knew that the airport was a training facility for military pilots in the 40s, they'd look at you and think you had 3 heads or something. Because there's people that don't even know there is an airport.
Yeah.
in Corsicana.
yeah, true.
So, and it's even the same with the oil business. Even though the whole town was built around that, there's still someone in that town that probably doesn't know the history.
Yeah.
So, and they try to preserve that, but it's just like anything else. You only have what you have left.
Yeah.
And if someone got rid of it before, it's gone.
Yeah.
So, and every little town has its own history, and it's basically their responsibility if they want to, especially if they want to play off of it. This is our history. Well, show us something.
Right. Yep.
Well, I'm looking forward to it, and
Yeah.
it's gonna be fun. We'll definitely keep everybody who listens to the podcast up to date. Yeah, thanks for being on.
Well, thank you.
I appreciate it, and yeah, a lot of cool stuff to dig through, and
Thanks for having me on, and we'll get the thing done.
yeah, then to the next thing.
And yeah, someone asked me the other day, "What's the next project?" And I said,
A
"I
vacation.
haven't really thought about it."
Time.
He said, "Well, we got to do a documentary on those 3 guys that had 2 mics in their car garage." It ended up being such a great podcast.
need some AC
Donald
in there.
Trump was tweeting about it.
Oh, but yeah, thanks again. I really
Yeah, thank
appreciate
you.
it, and yeah, looking forward to it. And you're the man. You're gonna do a good job. I know it.
Yeah.
It'll be awesome.
Yeah.
So thanks for those who've listened. This is Live Part Time with James Willis, and we will see you next week.
Peace.